Thank you very much, Philippe. We'll now move on a little bit more focused now on the kind of Russian sanctions. Our speaker, Bruce Paulson's partner at Sheridan Kissel. Bruce is giving a presentation, 2022, The Onslaught of Russia Sanctions. Bruce, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Philippe. I have a 20-minute slot, so I'm going to go at breakneck speed. Let me just start by saying it is really good to see everybody and to see everybody in person. And thank you, Marine Money, for this opportunity. Moving on to the presentation again, I don't have much time. I have my phone going, Kevin, so I'm watching. We're going to do a quick overview of the U.S. sanctions with respect to Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. I am not going to address EU and UK sanctions directly, although I will touch on them, but I'm not a EU or UK lawyer. We'll talk about recent developments in Russia sanctions, considerations for the shipping industry, even though the sanctions thus far, although I'll talk a little bit about what happened on March 31st, have been aimed at the financial services sector, and a bit, if I have time, about compliance. Okay, every time I do one of these presentations, I start with the basics. The basic types of American sanctions, the structure of American sanctions. There are basically three types of sanctions: primary, secondary, and sectoral. Sanctions really go back to the beginning of the Republic, and we didn't call them primary sanctions back then, we called them sanctions. Think Cuba. Think Iran. U.S. persons, and I'll get to that definition, cannot do business with Iran. It's an embargo. Same is true for Cuba. We now call these blocking sanctions. In addition, U.S. persons can't do business with those on the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list, what we call the SDN list. And OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, has other lists too of various different degrees of severity. But U.S. persons cannot do business with SDNs. Those are blocking sanctions, primary sanctions. Secondary sanctions started in the mid-90s with an attempt by Congress to legislate extraterritorially by sanctioning foreign companies doing business at that time with Libya and Iran. Secondary sanctions now still exist with respect to Iran, and when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was in place with respect to Iran, it wasn't the embargo preventing U.S. persons from doing business with Iran, the primary sanctions that were lifted. It was the secondary sanctions stopping foreign companies from doing business with Iran. And then with the incursion of Russia into Ukraine in 2014, we started with sectoral sanctions aimed at business and, in some cases, geographic sectors of Russia and Russian business. So when it comes to primary sanctions, think Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria. 2014, Crimea was added, but now we have Donetsk and Luhansk. Primary sanctions, can't do business with them. Other notable regimes are Venezuela and Belarus and Burma. We're going to touch a little on Belarus. But first and foremost, OFAC operates in a regulatory gray area. There is an awful lot of ambiguity in the regulations, the executive orders, the FAQs. Now, the Biden administration promised last year that they would be more plain spoken about sanctions, but the fact is the ambiguity keeps people on their toes. It keeps people from stepping over the line because they're not sure what they can or cannot do. For instance, there's a number of prescriptions in the OFAC regulations against particular substantial transactions. Former OFAC Director John Smith said at a conference a couple of years ago, a substantial transaction is what the director of OFAC says it is. So sometimes it's hard to tell what you can or can't do. But sanctions rules are designed to change behavior. They provide for civil and sometimes criminal sanctions and penalties, but there's also enormous reputational risk that comes with them. And often that is greater than the commercial risk. Okay, so I'll go quickly. U.S. person is a U.S. citizen, domicile, or resident. Entities organized under the laws of the United States or any state and any foreign branches, and any person in the U.S. If you're a foreigner doing business in the U.S. with Iran, you're violating sanctions rules. OFAC has a very broad view of its own jurisdiction. U.S. regulators will assert jurisdiction over any transaction that transits the U.S. financial system. It is a broad view, and you have to look at it broadly. There's a 50% rule. You're doing business with a company. The company's not an SDN, but it's owned 50% or more by SDNs. Then you are doing business with an SDN, and you could be exposed to sanctions. Just quickly, a map of Ukraine. You will see Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the east, which are now subject to U.S. embargoes. Quick history of Russia sanctions. In 2014, we had the imposition of sectoral sanctions pursuant to Executive Order 13662, which is still in play under the modern version of Russia sanctions. There were 4 directives. We're going to see the same structure when it comes to the new sanctions. Financial services sector, the energy sector, the defense sector, and then certain deep water, Arctic offshore, and this is where sectoral sanctions comes from. Those sectors of the economy were targeted in 2014. All right, then I'm going to slow down a little bit. And what's happened since February? We have a massive number of SDN designations going back to late February. If you're doing business with Russia, you need to do the KYC work to make sure you're not doing business with SDNs. The fact that, the Duma has been sanctioned probably doesn't affect the shipping business too much, but there's an awful lot of banks and entities and individuals that have now been designated. We have the embargoes, the regional embargoes that I mentioned, and there are a heap of general licenses that allow certain persons in certain cases to do business, despite these prohibitions. For instance, there's a general license that allow individuals and entities in Donetsk and Luhansk to conduct civil maritime services. So you need to look at the prohibitions, but you have to look at the general licenses, and you can get specific licenses in some circumstances from OFAC to do business that would otherwise be prohibited. All right. Let's start with Directive 1A under Executive Order 14024. Very boring number, just throw it out there, but it was actually issued in April, almost a year ago, April 15, 2021, and it is the sort of backbone of the new Russia sanctions regime. Directive 1 is targeted at the secondary market in Russian debt. Primary market had previously been targeted. But now, if you're trading Russian bonds in the secondary market, you've got a problem if you're a U.S. person. Directive 2 prohibits a U.S. financial institution from opening or maintaining a correspondent account or a payable through account. This is substantial, with a certain list of financial institutions, which, for instance, includes Sberbank. This creates headaches for basically anybody doing business in Russia. These sanctions went into effect on March 26, so just 2 weeks ago. Directive 3 of Executive Order 14024, which is directed against, and I like this term, Russian harmful foreign activities, euphemism if there ever was one. Directive 3 prohibits all transactions in provision of financing for and other dealings in new debt of longer than 14 days maturity or new equity for U.S. persons or within the United States for the entities listed in the annex. Okay, so no new debt. The annex, Credit Bank of Moscow, Gazprom Bank, Alpha Bank, Sovcomflot, Alrosa, Gazprom, Sberbank. This one goes back to February 24th, so it's ancient history in this. But these are substantial prohibitions. And what is new debt? New debt can be you're owed a bill. It's not paid. It's not paid for 14 days. You've extended credit. So you need to be careful about these directives and who you're doing business with. Directive 4, the last directive under this executive order, prohibits a U.S. person from aging in any transaction involving the central bank of the Russian Federation. Philippe can probably tell you the consequences of that. Substantial. Okay, then on March 8th, 2022, under another executive order, the importation of oil, gas, and coal into the United States was prohibited. There is a general license that allows those transactions to wind down, and it gives you until June 24th to do so, and as we speak, cargoes are being diverted away from the United States. Of course, the amount of oil we import from Russia is reasonably small. And then substantially, on March 31st, the U.S. Department of the Treasury issued a determination that the sanctions imposed on the Russian Federation economy, pursuant again to Executive Order 14024, apply to the marine sector. And I'll read you the language. Any property in the U.S. or in possession of a person, of a U.S. person, of a person operating in the tech, defense, aerospace, or marine sectors is blocked, okay? Blocked. That means primary sanctions. U.S. persons cannot possess the property of somebody in the marine sector in Russia. What does this mean? Does that mean an account? Yes. Does it mean equipment? Yes. Anything in the possession of a U.S. person in respect to the marine sector in Russia is blocked. So this is the first sort of specific maritime-directed portion of these sanctions. But again, even though they're not directed at shipping, they affect shipping profoundly. Also, the Department of Justice has set up an interagency task force with the colorful name of klepto capture, which is intended to enforce these sanctions. All right, so after we sent in this slideshow, and before this conference, we had further developments, which are, of course, not in the slideshow, but significantly last Wednesday, on April 6th, full blocking sanctions against Sberbank and Alpha Bank. This, as I'm sure I don't need to go into, affects almost everybody in this room. On April 7th, last Thursday, United Shipbuilding in Russia was sanctioned. So now you're reasonably up to date. So, considerations for the shipping industry. First and foremost, on May 20th, 2020, OFAC issued an advisory to those in the maritime industry on the impact of sanctions. It was nothing new, but it was an accumulation of all the prior guidance that OFAC had given shipping, going back almost 10 years to the secondary sanctions back in 2010 against Iran. Everybody in the compliance space in this room and in their businesses needs to know this advisory. And of course, KYC still is the most important thing. You need to know who you're doing business with. I was told at the coffee hour this morning that, at some point you need to vet a ship within 6 hours. That's hard to do and get the compliance and due diligence right, but you've got to be able to do it, so you need to be set up to do it. You need to look at if you're an owner, you need to look at your time charter, and you need to have the appropriate sanctions language in it, and you need to know who the subcharterers are, and you need to know what's on the ship. OFAC's view is you're the ship owner, it's your ship, you got to know the answer that, well, it's time chartered out and it's under the orders of the time charter, so I don't really know where it's aboard, is not going to suffice. Okay, if you're transacting or otherwise dealing with Russian banks, you obviously need to have a hard look. If you're transporting a cargo that has a sanction nexus, and this could have happened sort of innocently, these sanctions have rolled out so quickly, at times sloppily, from the U.S. government. You could have, say, the cargo of an SDN aboard your ship that was perfectly legal when it was loaded, but is now a problem. And so you need to think about blocking if you are a U.S. person and the Cargo belongs to an SDN, that is a blocked asset. And what you need to do is freeze it, whether it's a cargo aboard your ship or maybe it's money in your account. You can't disperse it, you can't refund it, you need to block it, and within 10 business days file a, quote, blocked property report with OFAC to let them know that you have this in your possession and, find out what to do with it. Payments to crew and other service providers may be hampered by these banking restrictions. If you have Russian crew members and they're being paid through a Russian bank, you may have trouble paying your crew. Obviously, the transport of Russian oil has implications all over the world, both under the U.S. and EU and UK sanctions regimes. New debt prohibitions, extending credit can happen in an eye blink without you even knowing it. So you need to be careful about who you're doing business with and who you're extending credit to. And again, the marine sector, there's going to be guidance that comes out, and there's hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll have more clarification about what exactly that means. What a lot of companies are doing too is self-sanctioning, what Business Insider the other day called moral sanctioning. I'm not sure if that's the right language or not, but a lot of people are getting out of the market in Russia, whether they are specifically required to by any sanctions regime or not. We saw this a dozen years ago when the first major secondary sanctions were levied against Iran in what was called the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Divestiture Act, or CISADA. A lot of big players got out of the market, say for shipments of oil, petrochemicals, et cetera, out of Iran. We're seeing some of that now, but also where there is risk, right, there is opportunity, and there are players in the industry, and there were in Iran in 2010, and there are now, who see premiums for sanctions busting or simply just taking on risky business. So we're going to see more of that. The EU sanctions and UK sanctions that have come with this in some ways have been out ahead of US sanctions. For instance, there have been more oligarchs sanctioned here than in the US. Well, you have more oligarchs here than we have, but for whatever reason there's some differences, but the structure is about the same. But the primary difference is that OFAC has been operating, has a licensing and enforcement division that is perhaps understaffed in the current circumstances, but has done this for many years. These infrastructures are now being built in Europe and the UK and may act more slowly because they're really just getting started, because the prior sanctions regimes were not enforced terribly stringently. And again, there are US general and specific licenses that can be obtained if you have a problem. Okay, a little bit about compliance. I have 2.5 on my phone. All right, so I'll go quickly through compliance, which I didn't know if I was even going to get to at all. So you need to have a living compliance plan. It needs to be enforced by management. There needs to be a tone from the top. It can't be something in a drawer, and this is more important than ever. And if a problem arises and you need to demonstrate to OFAC that you have, taken the steps. I vetted the ship this way. I did the KYC check. I did A, I did B, I did C. You need to have that audit trail in place in the event that there's a problem and to keep you out of trouble in the first place. You need to do the risk assessment. You need to make sure you have the right clauses in your contract. You need to review the contracts that you have, the charters for appropriate sanctions clauses, management agreements, et cetera. There may be disclosure obligations under your lending agreements. If you're a public company, you may have issues with disclosure to investors if you run into a sanctions problem. You need to make sure that everybody's screened and that everybody's trained. And there are times when you may want to disclose to OFAC, and because we're running out of time, I won't get into that. So that has been a breakneck-paced trip through the new sanctions regime. Thank you, Kevin and Marine Money, for the opportunity.